Following is a video showing the GEnx 1B transfer gearbox, or TGB, removal and installation from an engine that is installed on the aircraft wing. Service Bulletin 72-0298 calls for the replacement of the TGB with an updated configuration. For a detailed written description of this procedure, refer to Chapter 72-62-01, Accessory Gearbox Radial Drive Shaft Removal, in the Boeing 787 Aircraft Maintenance Manual. This digital training aid gives the technician visual help in performing this task. Make sure that the variable frequency starter generator and engine oil and air oil heat exchangers are installed in the fan case to prevent damage during the TGB removal and installation procedure. The engine oil system must be drained. Open the oil tank filler to allow air into the oil system as it is drained. One at a time, remove the drain plugs or caps of the engine oil supply line, oil return line, air oil heat exchanger supply line, and air oil heat exchanger oil return line, and drain the engine oil into a container. Relieve the pressure in each of the VFSG systems by removing the caps and attaching the overfill line of a remote service cart to each of the VFSG's overfill drain valves. Drain the left and right VFSG oil systems by removing the plugs of the VFSG's air oil heat exchanger oil supply and oil return lines, and draining the oils into a container. The drain and service module assembly can now be removed. Remove the bolts and safety wire and remove the fire blanket from around the electrical harnesses. Remove the bottom of the fire seal where the engine electrical harnesses pass through and remove the seals. Remove the electrical harnesses from the spring clips of the drain and service module and tie wrap them out of the way. Disconnect the VFSG fill and overflow oil service tubes at the top of the drain and service module assembly. Disconnect the fire detection sensor wiring. Disconnect the drain tube flanges and remove the gasket seal. Remove the aft bolts of the left and right support brackets just above the overboard drain mast. Remove the bolts that attach the drain and service module assembly to the bifurcation and remove the drain and service module. At the bottom of the fan case and in front of the bifurcation fire seal, remove the 8 flange bolts of the engine oil and air oil surface cooler supply and return tubes. Disconnect the left and right VFSG oil supply and return tubes. Disconnect the engine sensor air tubes. At the top of the lower bifurcation assembly and on the left and right sides, remove the bolts, brackets, and gasket seals that attach the engine oil and air oil heat exchanger supply and return lines. Remove the left and right support brackets from the engine oil supply and return and air oil heat exchanger supply and return tubes. Remove the screws that attach the engine oil supply and return lines and air oil heat exchanger supply and return tubes to the bifurcation and remove the tubes. Remove the brackets and bolts of the VFSG supply and return tube flanges and remove the gasket. Disconnect the engine sensor air tubes at the top of the bifurcation assembly. Remove the screws and bolts that attach the bifurcation and the fire seal to the lower firewall and remove the bifurcation. Remove the screws of each of the 7 blank-off panels and 1 flow shield and remove them from the engine intercal support. Note that the blank-off panel positions are numbered on the underside of each panel. Remove the upper and lower fillet fairings from the upper and lower bifurcation firewalls. Remove the 10 bleed air deflector panels from the intercal support. Note that the 10 bleed air deflector panels are the same part number and all are interchangeable. The bolt flanges of the left and right fan cowl supports are now accessible. Inside the upper bifurcation firewall, disconnect the oil tank ventilation tube by removing the bolts, nuts, and gasket seal. Disconnect the engine anti-ice duct at the upper bifurcation firewall by removing the clamp and seal. Remove the upper bifurcation bridge at the 12 o'clock position of the intercal support by disconnecting the fire extinguishing tube at the top and bottom of the tube. Then remove the attaching nuts, fire extinguishing tube, cable bracket, and the firewall bolts and remove the upper bifurcation bridge. Remove the lower bifurcation bridge at the 6 o'clock position of the intercal support by removing the attaching nuts and the firewall bolts. Remove the screws of the lower left-hand and right-hand extension panels and remove them from the engine. Remove the 3 bolts and nuts and remove the lower bifurcation firewall. Remove the 3 bolts that attach the engine anti-ice valve controller to the right support cowl. Remove the 4 bolts that attach the harness support bracket and the 2 hydraulic pressure hose block clamps to the right support cowl, and remove the clamps and harness support bracket. Remove the other brackets from the right support cowl as necessary to be able to remove the cowl. Remove the harness support brackets from the left support cowl as necessary to be able to move the support cowl. Remove the 40 bolts and washers that attach the 10 variable bleed valve ducts to the left side support cowl and the right side support cowl. There are 4 bolts and washers on each variable bypass valve duct. Remove the 8 bolts and washers that attach the LPT HPT active clearance control fan air inlet duct to the left support cowl. Remove the 5 bolts and nuts at the 12 o'clock position that attach the left and right side support cowls together and remove the bracket. Remove the 5 bolts and nuts at the 6 o'clock position that attach the left and right support cowls together. Remove the 18 bolts and spacers that attach the right side support cowl assembly to the fan hub frame. Remove the 18 bolts and spacers that attach the left side support cowl assembly to the fan hub frame. While moving the left support cowl as necessary, pull the right side support cowl assembly radially outward, starting at the top and working your way down until you can remove it from the engine. Remove the 4 bolts that attach the variable bypass valve duct at the 5:30 o'clock position to the fan hub frame and remove it. Disconnect the transfer gearbox scavenge tube clamps from the A-sump scavenge tube and bracket bolt from the accessory gearbox mounted bracket. Remove the 3 bolts that attach the A-sump scavenge tube to the lube and scavenge pump and remove the gasket seal. Remove the 4 bolts that attach the A-sump scavenge tube to the fan hub frame and remove the gasket seal and the tube. Remove the 4 bolts that attach the transfer gearbox oil scavenge tube to the transfer gearbox and remove the gasket seal. Disconnect the transfer gearbox scavenge tube B-nut from the lube and scavenge pump and remove the tube. On the right side, remove the 4 bolts and gasket seal from the engine oil tube at the main fuel oil heat exchanger. Remove the clamps and remove the tube, working it downward and out. On the right side and at the top, disconnect the B-nuts of the engine oil tube. Remove the clamp. Position the tube out of the way and tie wrap it. Disconnect the electronic engine control air sense manifold B-nuts. Disconnect the electronic engine control air sense manifold clamps and remove the manifold. Disconnect the transfer gearbox oil supply tube B-nuts from the engine oil tube and the transfer gearbox and remove the tube from the engine. On the left side at the lube and scavenge pump, remove the 4 bolts, gasket seal and bracket, and the engine oil tube. Disconnect the transfer gearbox reference pressure tube B-nuts from the transfer gearbox and the oil pressure sensor mount. Remove the clamp and remove the tube. On the left side, remove the two bolts that attach the engine oil tube and sensor from the mounting bracket. Remove the clamps and move the engine oil tube aft and out of the way. Disconnect the 4 B-nuts and remove the variable frequency starter generator upper oil manifold. Remove the 4 bolts that attach the horizontal drive shaft cover retaining ring to the transfer gearbox and move the retaining ring aft to the accessory gearbox. Install the removal tool on the horizontal drive shaft cover with the swivel pad fully retracted. Tighten the screw until the swivel pad touches a transfer gearbox retaining ring bolt pad. Apply torque to the screw until the shaft cover disengages from the transfer gearbox. Remove the tool from the horizontal drive shaft cover and move the horizontal drive shaft cover aft into the accessory gearbox. To be able to disengage the horizontal drive shaft from the transfer gearbox, you must remove the right, aft looking forward, variable frequency starter generator. Disconnect all of the electrical connectors from the variable frequency starter generator. Remove the bolt and clamp that attaches the wire harness for the electrical connector to the variable frequency starter generator. Remove the screws and washers that attach the terminal block cover to the variable frequency starter generator and remove the terminal block cover. Remove the nuts and washers from the 4 terminal studs on the terminal block. Disconnect the power feeder cables and neutral from the 4 terminal studs. Disconnect the pressure fill and overfill lines from the variable frequency starter generator. Remove the bracket bolts and clamps and remove the pressure fill and overfill lines from the variable frequency starter generator. Disconnect the oil out and return tubes from the variable frequency starter generator. With the variable frequency starter generator bracket installed on the LRU jack stand, move them into position and raise them into position. Put the loose end of the strap over the top of the variable frequency starter generator. Install the strap into the cam buckle and tighten the strap. Loosen the tension bolt on the quick attach-detach coupling until you can move the variable frequency starter generator. Remove the variable frequency starter generator. Note, you cannot remove the horizontal drive shaft from the aft side of the accessory gearbox. Engage the horizontal drive shaft removal tool into the horizontal drive shaft in the VFSG drive pad. Adjust the tool until it is tightly expanded into the drive shaft. Use the slide hammer to disengage the horizontal drive shaft from the transfer gearbox. Remove the two bolts that attach the two index pins to the transfer gearbox and remove the pins. Remove the remaining 10 bolts and washers that attach the transfer gearbox to the fan hub frame. Place a rope through one of the left support cowl bolt holes that attaches it to the right support cowl. Someone can pull down and aft to help during the removal of the transfer gearbox. Working the transfer gearbox down and aft, remove the transfer gearbox from the fan hub frame. Installation of the transfer gearbox. The horizontal drive shaft cover preform packings must be replaced before installation. Caution: make sure that the preform packings on the horizontal shaft cover are correctly lubricated with engine oil to prevent damage. It is easy to roll, pinch, nick, or cut the preform packings when you move the horizontal shaft cover in and out of the AGB module. Be careful not to cause damage to the preform packings. Apply the engine oil to the preform packing and lead-in chamfer of the shaft cover. Install the preform packing into the groove on the aft end of the shaft cover. Apply the engine oil to the preform packing and install the preform packing into the groove on the forward end of the shaft cover. Install the horizontal shaft cover retaining ring over the aft end of the shaft cover. Install the retaining ring with the rabbet on the inner diameter of the retaining ring forward. Apply engine oil on the inside lip of the accessory gearbox, or AGB, shaft bore in which the horizontal drive shaft cover will be installed. Install the shaft cover into the AGB module port until the shaft cover stops. Put the transfer gearbox into its position on the fan hub frame. Turn the transfer gearbox to engage the radial drive shaft spline with the transfer gearbox. Working the transfer gearbox up and forward, install the transfer gearbox onto the fan hub frame. Install the 10 bolts and washers to attach the transfer gearbox to the fan hub frame. With the transfer gearbox installed, put the 2 index pins and their bolts in position on the transfer gearbox. Tighten and torque the 12 bolts. If the horizontal drive shaft will not engage and move forward when tapped, you can remove the accessory gearbox turning pad cover and rotate the accessory gearbox while tapping the horizontal drive shaft forward. Engage the horizontal drive shaft into the transfer gearbox. Using a plastic mallet and nylon drift, tap the horizontal drive shaft into position in the accessory gearbox and transfer gearbox. Apply engine oil to the lead-in chamfer of the transfer gearbox, or TGB. Use steady, even pressure when you move the horizontal shaft cover. Twist the horizontal shaft cover as you move it forward until it mates with the flange of the TGB housing. Apply lubricant to the threads and washer faces of the bolts. Move the retaining ring forward and align the bolt holes with the flange on the TGB housing. Attach the horizontal shaft cover retaining ring to the TGB with the bolts. Alternately tighten the 4 bolts in a crisscross pattern on the retaining ring to pull the cover and preform packing evenly into the TGB. Torque the bolts to 106 to 124 inch-pounds or 12 to 14 Newton meters. To prevent loss of oil during operation, make sure the aft preform packing is seated correctly. Try to install a 0.010 inch or 1/4 millimeter feeler gauge between the horizontal shaft cover and the shaft bore of the AGB housing. Be sure and do this check 360 degrees around the cover and AGB. If the feeler gauge moves freely into the bore, the preformed packing is damaged or not seated correctly and must be replaced. Lubricate the preformed packing with engine oil and install it on the VFSG drive shaft. The VFSG spline adapter alignment tool is recommended equipment. This tool aligns the variable frequency starter generator to the engine accessory gearbox to reduce the chance of damaging the VFSG shaft preform packing. Put the spline adapter alignment tool into the input spline of the engine accessory gearbox and timing pin hole. Loosen the knob on the spline adapter alignment tool and adjust the spline adapter alignment tool until the bubble is in the center location of the level. Tighten the knob on the spline adapter alignment tool with your fingers. Remove the spline adapter alignment tool from the input spline of the engine accessory gearbox and place the spline adapter alignment tool onto the input shaft of the variable frequency starter generator and timing pin. Make sure that the bubble is in the center location of the level. If the bubble is not in the center location, use the adjustment handles on the LRU jack stand until the bubble is in the center location of the level. Remove and stow the spline adapter alignment tool. Raise the VFSG into position. Move the VFSG forward, engaging the VFSG drive shaft into the accessory gearbox drive shaft. Continue to work the VFSG forward until it is seated into the quad ring. Turn the bolt to rotate the quad ring to clamp the VFSG into position. Lightly hit the edge of the quad ring with a lightweight drift at 3 equal locations, then continue to tighten and torque the quad ring. Release the LRU jack stand strap. Lower the LRU jack stand and move it away from the engine. Connect the oil supply out and return tubes to the variable frequency starter generator. Tighten and torque the B-nuts. Connect the pressure fill and overfill lines to the variable frequency starter generator. Install the bolts into the bracket and clamps. Tighten and torque the bolts, clamps, and tube B-nuts. Connect the power feeder cables and neutral onto the 4 terminal studs with the washers and nuts. Tighten and torque the nuts. Put the terminal block cover onto the variable frequency starter generator and install the washers and screws. Connect and tighten all the electrical connectors to the variable frequency starter generator. Install the bolt and clamp that attaches the wire harness to the variable frequency starter generator. Install the variable frequency starter generator upper oil manifold and start the 4 B-nuts. Tighten and torque the 4 B-nuts. On the left side, place the engine oil tube and sensor back into position and install the clamps. Install the 2 bolts that attach the engine oil tube to the mounting bracket. Install the transfer gearbox reference pressure tube and start the B-nuts to the oil pressure sensor mount and the transfer gearbox. Install the loop clamp, then tighten and torque the B-nuts. On the left side, install the engine oil tube into position. Install the gasket seal, 4 bolts, and bracket that attach the engine oil tube to the lube and scavenge pump. Tighten and torque the bolts. Install and start the B-nuts that attach the oil supply tube from the transfer gearbox to the engine oil tube. Tighten and torque the B-nuts. Put the electronic engine control air sense manifold into position and start the B-nuts. Connect the electronic engine control air sense manifold bracket to the transfer gearbox. Tighten and torque the B-nuts and bracket bolts. On the right side, cut the tie wrap and put the engine oil tube back into position and start the B-nuts at the top. Tighten and torque the B-nuts. Install the clamp onto the tube. On the right side, put the engine oil tube into position. Install the gasket seal and the 4 bolts at the main fuel oil heat exchanger flange. Tighten and torque the bolts. Install the clamps onto the tube. Put the transfer gearbox scavenge tube into place and start the B-nut onto the lube and scavenge pump. Install the gasket seal and 4 bolts that attach the transfer gearbox oil scavenge tube to the transfer gearbox. Tighten and torque the B-nut and the bolts. Put the A-sump scavenge tube into position. Install the bracket bolt to hold the A-sump tube in position. Install the gasket seal and start the 3 bolts that attach the A-sump scavenge tube to the lube and scavenge pump. Install the gasket seal and the 4 bolts that attach the A-sump scavenge tube to the fan hub frame. Tighten and torque the 7 flange bolts. Install the transfer gearbox scavenge tube clamps to the A-sump scavenge tube and to the accessory gearbox mounted bracket. Install the variable bypass valve duct at the 530 o'clock position on the fan hub frame. Install, tighten, and torque the 4 bolts. Starting from the bottom, work the right side support cowl back into position on the fan hub frame. Install, tighten, and torque the 18 bolts and spacers to attach the right support cowl to the fan hub frame. Put the left side support cowl into its position on the fan hub frame. Install, tighten, and torque the 18 bolts and spacers. Install the bracket, 5 bolts, and nuts at the 12 o'clock position that attach the right support cowl to the left support cowl. Tighten and torque the 5 bolts. Install the 5 bolts at the 6 o'clock position that attach the right side support cowl to the left side support cowl. Tighten and torque the 5 bolts. Install the 8 bolts and washers that attach the LPT HPT active clearance control fan air inlet duct to the left support cowl. Install the 40 bolts and washers that attach the 10 variable bleed valve ducts to the left support cowl and the right support cowl. Tighten and torque the 40 bolts. Install the harness support brackets on the left side support cowl and right side support cowl that have been disconnected. Tighten and torque the bolts for each bracket. Install the 3 bolts that attach the engine anti-ice valve controller to the right cowl support. Tighten and torque the bolts. Install the 2 hydraulic hose block clamps. Place the harness support bracket in position and install the 4 bolts that attach them to the right support cowl. Tighten and torque the bolts. Put the lower bifurcation firewall into position and install the 3 bolts and nuts. Install the lower left hand and right hand extension panels. Install the gasket seals and connect the oil tank ventilation tube flanges to the fan cowl support. Install the upper bifurcation bridge, fire extinguishing tube, and cable bracket at the 12 o'clock position of the inner cowl support. Connect the engine anti-ice duct at the upper bifurcation firewall. Install the lower bifurcation bridge at the 6 o'clock position of the fan cowl support. Install the 10 bleed air deflector panels onto the fan cowl supports. The 10 panels are the same part number and are all interchangeable. Next, install the upper and lower fillet fairings for the upper and lower bifurcation firewalls. The blank-off panels have their installation positions marked on the inside of the panels. Install each panel at the proper position 1 through 8, aft looking forward, and starting at 12 o'clock of the inner cowl support, counting clockwise for position 1 through 8. Make sure that the flow shield is installed over the HPT LPT active clearance control air intake ducts, and then install the 7 blank-off panels at their proper positions. Make sure the engine oil and air oil heat exchanger tubes at the bottom of the fan case have the O-rings installed before installing the lower bifurcation. Position the lower bifurcation onto the fan stator lower firewall and install the screws and bolts to attach it into place. At the top of the lower bifurcation, attach the engine sensor air tubes. Install the gasket seal, brackets, and 4 bolts and nuts to connect the left and right VFSG oil supply and return oil tubes. Align the engine oil supply and return tubes and the air oil heat exchanger oil supply and return tubes to the bifurcation and install the bolts. Install the gasket seals, bolts, and bracket and attach the engine and air oil heat exchanger oil supply and return lines. On the front of the lower bifurcation fire seal, connect the engine sensor air tubes. Connect the left and right VFSG heat exchanger oil supply and return tubes. Position the flanges and bolt the oil tank and heat exchanger oil supply and return tubes in position. Before you install the drain and service module, make sure that the proper color-coded electrical harnesses are positioned on the correct side of the drain and service module. Install the left and right support brackets from the engine oil supply and return and air oil heat exchanger supply and return tubes. Position the drain and service module to the back of the lower bifurcation and bolt it into place. Install the left and right support brackets aft bolts just above the overboard drain mast. Install the gasket seal and connect the upper and lower drain tube flanges. Connect the fire detection sensor wiring. After the VFSG has been installed, connect the VFSG fill and overflow oil service tubes at the top of the drain and service module. Cut the tie wraps of the electrical harnesses and place them into their color-coded positions on the drain mast. Install them also into the left and right support cowl brackets. Position the fire seals onto the electrical harnesses into the bottom of the lower bifurcation and install the bottom panel. Install the fire blanket and bracket around the electrical harnesses after the fire seal. Install the bolts and safety wire as required. Finally, service the engine oil system at the oil tank and the left and right VFSG oil systems at the drain mast service panel. This completes the demonstration of the removal and installation of the GEnx 1B transfer gearbox. For a detailed written description of this procedure, refer to Chapter 72-62-01, Accessory Gearbox Radial Drive Shaft Removal in the Boeing 787 Aircraft Maintenance Manual.